All right, so welcome to GAME 2015. That is virtual reality development in the winter 2018 semester at George Brown, and we are lesson 2, week 2, part 1 of our broadcast. We're going to talk about Blender right now. I'm going to turn the lights down so you guys can see Blender. You need to see Blender. It's not, this screen isn't the greatest. There's a lot of details to look at. What I'm going to ask is, and I know that this is going to be, I'm going to go pretty fast. There are some shortcut keys I'm going to be talking about with Blender and all that kind of stuff as well. So this is an intro to Blender, but I also want to talk about your contracts, your team contracts, which are due now tomorrow. I've created a Dropbox on Blackboard. So please connect with your team, get that all done. It's going to be worth, it's worth a lab mark. It's part of our project this semester. And again, that's due tomorrow at midnight. Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify something. So you said there's 19 people in the class. There's supposed to be 6 per group.
Well, as much as you can, right? So it might be some people that are 5.
So it might be some 5.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. And you can also combine with other sections.
Oh, okay.
All right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want that. I just think 6 is a good number because you have enough oomph to get everything done, and then
it made a lot of sense with 6 guys.
And I also don't want to make it so that you guys are. I don't want this to be a burden class, like a class where you're really struggling because you have a lot of workload. There's other classes like that graphics course that you're taking right now. That's going to take a lot of time and effort. I know when I did the graphics courses, especially when you're using OpenGL and shaders and everything else, and VBOs and VAOs and all that stuff. Even with forward rendering, it can take a whole lot of time. And I think it's, I don't want to make this class a burden. I want to make this a good class, fun class, good learnings. We're only going to have, I plan only to have one presentation in this class, which should be the final presentation. You'll still be producing your first playable and all that stuff, but I will come around and look at it. I'm not going to get you to present it, okay? Because this is not a game production class. So the focus won't be on production in terms of, hey, show me what you've done, in the same rigor that we did in game production too. All right, so that's kind of the intro. Let's bring up Blender. Now notice I have a couple of Blender files that I've already done with the previous class, and I'm going to make another one with you. So I'm just bringing up Blender here. So I'm turning the lights off. I don't really like when the lights are off when I'm learning or when I'm teaching even, only because you guys can't see each other, and sometimes it becomes challenging to look at a bright screen. But we need to do this for Blender. Blender, it requires a bit of a resolution for you guys to see, and whenever you're learning some kind of graphic program, I think it's good. So Blender, what is it? It's an open source graphics manipulation program, 3D graphics manipulation program. Blender can do everything that Maya can do in 3D Studio Max for the most part. It just does it differently. And the great thing is, because it's open source, you can use it in your games, and it's fair. It's fair use, right? So it's not like you're using Maya and you'd have to pay for it eventually, and all that kind of stuff. Maya is a great program, and so is 3D Studio Max. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, right? So the stuff you're going to be learning today and for the rest of the semester, it's all transferable skill stuff that you're going to be able to move on. If you wanted to use 3D Studio Max or Maya, you're going to recognize some of the same features that we're going to be covering in this course with those programs. So why 3D graphics development with like some kind of modeling program? I think it's a really good thing for you guys to understand. We don't have another course like that in this program, and I think it'll be enough to get you going. Thing to note about Blender, it's been around for a long while. It's not a new program. It's been in development, I would say probably, at least 15 years as far as I know, right? So it's not a new thing. The great thing is it's run on the background. There's a Python runs Blender in the background, right? So it's built with Python, which is really cool. And you can script in Python on the back end to really create some really cool stuff. For example, procedural generation. You can do a lot of stuff in Blender to do things like everything from physics to make a whole game. There's multiple types of render modes. This one is called Blender Render that we're going to be using today. There's also a Blender game mode. We can actually make a full game in Blender, like a game engine that's bundled in Blender. You can do animation, rigging, all kinds of stuff. And it's a beautiful little program. I've used it for 3D texture mapping, 3D texturing. creating normal maps, making rigs, using models, you know, and I also made an add-on recently to make so I can make Blender or use Blender like a level editor for your 3D program. So, for example, if you're using, let's say, SDL or some other kind of framework, pure C++, and you can't visualize your level, you can make it a Blender. You can export it in a text file and read it in. And then literally it'll put your objects that you export from Blender into the exact positions that you see here. So really good little script that I wrote in Python. But anyways, that's later on. Right now what I want you to think about is what Blender looks like. So Blender, it looks like, you know, like the dials of a plane. There's like so many things you can learn. There's so many things that are hidden, and you know, it's similar to Maya in that way. And because the way Blender was built up, they keep on adding stuff to Blender. And some of the stuff may not make a whole lot of sense in terms of organization. However, there is a method to Blender's madness, if you will, right? One thing to note is this: my cursor, wherever it is, if it's on the left-hand side, the middle, or the right-hand side, notice if I switch between the two sides that I activate the window that I'm in with my cursor being in it, right? So if I want to do a command in Blender here or move something in Blender here, my cursor must be in this window for me to make it work, right? That's number one. So here I've got the toolbar. This is the toolbar, and the first I'm going to talk about some shortcut keys. The first shortcut key I want you to know is the T key. So if you press the T key on your keyboard, you can see that the toolbar can be hidden or shown. I'm also going to talk about this other bar over here on the right-hand side that you can't see right now. It's the Numeric Transform bar, and I can bring that into being by pressing the N key and toggling on and off. So that's N for Norman. Okay? So the N key. When I have my scene, if you notice, it's hard to see, but I have these three objects in the scene. I have my cube, I have a camera object, and I have a light source, which is a point lamp right now. All these three objects can be selected, and this is different about Blender. The only way you can select objects from Blender is with right-click, by right-clicking. So if I want to select my camera, I can right-click onto it. I can right-click on my light source. I can right-click on my cube. However, if I left-click somewhere else, notice what will happen is this little round circle right here will appear in somewhere in space. That little round circle is the three-dimensional cursor. And wherever I have that, that is going to be the spawn point for all new models that I want to bring into being. So we need to have that a lot of times in the center, and there's a couple ways to get in the center. The first way is if you go to the numeric keypad, and if I look down, if I scroll down to where it says 3D cursor, so again, I'm on the right side. I've brought it up with the N key. Guys, you need to do this. Please don't just watch me. Notice that there is X, Y, and Z coordinates. I want to type in 0, 0, and 0. And you can see that it's going to go back in the middle of the screen, in the origin, let's say, okay, right here in the middle. That's one way. So, but if I click away and I want it to be done a little quicker, there's also another shortcut key that you can use. If you press Shift-S, it'll bring up a little context menu, and then you can see that there is a cursor to center option. Please choose that. That's another option. So try that out, right? So we may always need to do that kind of stuff. If you move your cursor by accident in some random place, that's one thing that we need to do. Notice also that even though we have these objects here on the right, this part way up on the top right of my bar, and I can change the size of these panels by just dragging. On the right-hand side on the top, you can see that I have a scene object, and inside there I have my three objects, my camera, and if I zoom out for a second, you can see my camera, I've got my cube, and I've got my lamp, right? So I can left-click and select these in here, and right-click and select these here in the scene. Okay, so this is called the outliner in Blender. It's similar to the hierarchy in Unity and other programs you've used. If you notice also, if I right-click onto my cube and I can zoom in and out with my scroll wheel, for Blender, you need a 3-button mouse or equivalent, all right? So the scroll wheel that you have on your mouse is going to be the thing that's going to move us in and out when it comes to zooming in and out of Blender, okay? So this will actually zoom into a particular object, and you can see that I can actually, it's zooming in by a particular amount, all right, every time. Okay, so that's one thing. The manipulator arm here, this is the manipulator arm. You can see that there is a red, green, and blue arrow. These red, green, and blue arrows are, equivalent, like we've seen before in other programs, to the axis. So I can, if I grab this left arrow, this red arrow with my left mouse button, and I move it in and out, I can actually manipulate or translate my object across the x-axis. The x-axis is always red. And if I grab my green arrow and move it to the left and right, you can see that I'm translating across the y-axis. And in Blender, up is Z. So Z is the up axis here, okay? So I can, again, do that in Blender. If I want to tumble around the scene, I'm going to press down on my scroll wheel. So press into my scroll wheel, hold it, and drag. And I can tumble around the scene anywhere I like. If I press the scroll wheel and the shift key and drag, press down the scroll wheel and the shift key and drag, I can actually pan or basically motor around here like this, up and down. So you can see that I can move my object, my grid, which automatically comes into being for you guys by using those things. So again, shift and the scroll wheel, if you hold it down, and you can move around that way. Any questions so far? So some simple navigation, all right? And if I want to get rid of my cube, let's say as an example, I can press the X button. Let's press the X button in the middle while my mouse is here, and it'll ask me to get rid of it. I can delete my cube, so my cube can disappear, right? If I want to restart my Blender, I can press Control N, right, and get back to the way we started with our start scene. Okay, so we'll have to do that a couple times because one of the challenges we have when 3D modeling, we make mistakes, and you might want to try and correct the mistake, but sometimes it's just better to start over, right? Because of all the complex things you have to do to correct what you're trying to do. So that's one thing. So again, navigation, your mouse must be in the middle to do all that navigation. Okay, the other things you need to do, all right? I want to translate, right, like we just did. I can pull the manipulator arm. But notice on the bottom here of the screen, I have these buttons. I have this arrow, I have this arc, and I have this arrow with a little bulge on the end, right, or a little square on the end. If I go to the arc, I get the ability for me to rotate across a particular axis, depending on the axis color that I choose, right, where green is the y-axis and so on, similar. And then if I go to the other option, which is down here, I can basically scale my object across a different axis, depending on which axis I choose, right?
That's on the axis, not the figure.
On the axis, across the axis, right? So the whole object will grow across the axis, so whatever that is, right? So now let's start over. So Control N again. So Control N starts over. You can also go to your trusty menu up here and go File, New, and then that'll do the same thing. It'll reload the startup file. But that's cool and everything else that you can do that with the buttons. But the faster way to translate is to press the G key. Press the G key. Then that'll allow you to freely translate the object anywhere in three-dimensional space. If I follow it up with an axis, so G plus then something like X, I can limit myself across the X. If I switch to the Y, I can go across the Y. And if I don't want to complete my translation, I can press Escape. Escape, so what happens is, first, I must select the object, right? So I select it with the right mouse button. Then I press a key to do a command, like G, right? And then I can press an axis to translate over, right? For example, the x-axis. If I want to complete the translation, I can press the left mouse button. So I just kind of, left mouse button completes the translation. I can also undo, Control Z, right? Just keep in mind, there's only 32 levels of undo right now as a preset. You can increase that later on. There's ways of increasing it in the preferences. I don't want to show you that right now, but just keep that in mind. There's 32 levels of undo, right? By default. Okay, so now we have this. You can see that we can translate it with the G key. I can rotate it with the R key. So R rotates everywhere. If I want to rotate it across an axis, I can do X, rotate it across an axis, or Y or Z. And you can see that I can rotate the object any way I want. If I want to scale an object, the hotkey is the S key. So S for scale, the whole object, S and X. I can go across the X-axis, S and Y, and I can translate or scale across the Y-axis. Okay, so we've talked about positioning, position, location, or location, rotation, and scale. And those are the three things we can do in this mode to move objects around in Blender as long as my mouse is centered in the middle editor screen, okay, which is right here, right? And this is great. Still a little boring, right? But I got to kind of put you through the whole navigation, how to scale, how to select stuff, very basic things. So I want to get rid of the cube. Again, I press X to delete it. If I want to add new objects, right, the best way to do that is Shift A. Shift A gives me a little menu here, and I can add other primitive objects. All I care about in this course, for the most part, is going to be meshes, right? And you can see that I can add in other objects. For example, a UV sphere, right? Or something else, right? So I can add primitives with Shift A. The primitive will appear where my three-dimensional cursor is. So an example would be if I put my three-dimensional cursor there on the screen and Shift A and add another cube, let's say, the cube will appear in that exact position wherever I put my three-dimensional cursor, okay? Starting over, just to reset my scene again. The other thing I want you to think about is sometimes, actually a lot of times when we model, and we're going to get to this, right? I want to model from one perspective. Right now, we're looking at the scene in perspective mode, right? You can see that the cube looks bigger when it's closer to us and farther away. This is the perspective. We have a frustum, if you will, of us looking at the near plane and the far plane, just like we normally would in a game, right? And that's great for looking at an object in 3D, but not great for modeling. A lot of times what we want to do when we model is looking at it from one perspective. So the handy-dandy numpad on your keyboard, if you press the 7 key on your numpad, you can see that I will start looking at it from a top view, right? If I press the 1 key, I will press it from the front view. And the 3 key will look at it from the right view, okay? So those are handy little things we can do. Still, though, we're in perspective mode, and if I click down on my scroll wheel, you can see that I can still see everything in perspective. And that's okay, but it's not as accurate as me seeing things in orthographic mode. So if I press the 7 key again, do this with me, guys, 7. And then if I press the 5 key on the numpad, 7 and then 5 key on the numpad, you can see that it becomes perfectly flat. And what this does is it's an orthographic view of my object. So you can see that it looks more like a square now than a cube. And if I actually press the scroll wheel down and translate, now I'm looking at it in a kind of funky orthographic view, as opposed to, if I press the 5 key again, a perspective view. So perspective, orthographic, perspective, orthographic. And I want to do things in orthographic view a lot of times from one angle, or one side, right? So right now I'm looking at it from the top. You can see on the top left corner, it even tells you what it is, top ortho, right? On the top left corner. Okay, so that's one thing to know. So I can look at an object and start manipulating it in this way. On the right panel, I want to kind of bring your attention to the right panel now. The right panel has several tabs. That's what I'd like to call them on the right-hand side here. If I scroll the wheel, I can see that there's several tabs we're going to go to. One of the tabs, for example, the third one from the left, is the Scene tab. And if you look at the units, there's a units area down here, right? Blender, as a default, uses something called Blender units, which mean nothing for us. When we want to bring something into Unity, we want to use meters, right? So I want to change this unit presets from units to meters. Please do that. So now you can see that it says top ortho meters on the top left corner of the screen, right? Other things you can do with the tabs, if you look at the tab keys over here, right, or these tabs, if I scroll over, there is this something that looks like a circle, right? Here's a circle. And this circle is material. So you can see I can actually change the shader. So it's way over here in the tabs. It's like the third one or fourth one from the right, right? You can see that there's a little material. And right now you can see that there's the diffuse and the specular shader setup that they've set up here. And again, this is Blender render. Cycles render is a little different, but for now you can see that this is what it is. If I click inside this area here, I can change the color of my object by changing the shader, the diffuse shader color that's in here, okay? And I can change specular highlights and all that kind of stuff. We won't be using color today, but I wanted to show you where that is. And there's other things we're going to learn how to do in this course. We're going to change the material. We're going to look at the shaders. We're going to modify the specular setup. We're going to do all that kind of stuff slowly until you get comfortable with using Blender. All right, I want to start over. So Control-N to start over. So I'm going to start over from my default scene again. Here I am, right? And I'm doing this a bunch of times to get you to feel what it's like to explore a little bit in Blender if you make a mistake. If I wanted to duplicate objects in Blender, this is very common to do, I'm going to use the Shift-D command. Shift-D will allow me to make a duplicate of my object. I can also tell it specifically where to go across the Y-axis, as an example, with the Y key, right? I can also Shift-D again and press the Z key and duplicate it across the Z-axis. Shift-D again, and then press the X key to duplicate it across the X-axis, right? So you can see that they're exact objects duplicated. Shift-D for duplication, right? One thing to note, and I kind of did this a little differently in the morning class, is there are 3 different properties of all objects besides location, rotation, and scale. Location, rotation, and scale is like properties of where they are in 3-dimensional in the global coordinate system, right? And by default, we're looking at the global coordinate system right now. But every polygonal model has at least 3 different types of ways to select it, right? I can select it according to its vertices, its edges, and its faces. By default, we can't do any of that level of selection until we go into edit mode. Right now, what you're looking at is object mode. I can create objects. They will be added to the outliner on the top right corner of the of Blender over here. And as you can see, I've got several cubes that I've added into Blender on the top right corner, okay? So several cubes, here it is. And as you can see here, what I've got is I've added objects. But what if I want to manipulate one object? How do I do that? So again, let's just start off on your project to do this so you can see this cleanly. I'm going to go into this object. I've got this already selected. I'm going to press the tab key, and it takes me into edit mode, right? So there's edit mode, and if I click the tab key again, it moves back to object mode. Edit mode, object mode. And if you notice when I do that, you can see that the context here has changed in terms of the buttons that are available to me on the left-hand side. If I press the N key, you can also see that the numeric properties here are different as well, right? So edit mode allows me to manipulate different parts of the object. Right now, you can see in edit mode that I have everything selected because it's purely orange, right, in edit mode. Again, edit mode can also be accessed by this key down here on the left-hand corner, right here. And you can change from edit mode to object mode. There's other modes as well. All we care about for today is either edit mode or object mode, okay? There are other things we're going to do. For example, I can do texture painting. I can do all kinds of weight painting when it comes to 3-dimensional modeling and with rigs. There's all kinds of stuff you can do here, but all we care about is edit mode and object mode right now. We're in object mode. I've got my cube selected, and I've been moving it around by eye, right? So whenever I move my cube around, I'm just like moving it around, and I think it might be in the right position or whatever. But for the most part, what we're going to do is here on the right-hand side with Numeric Transform, I can actually put in a number. So I can put in a number like 5, as an example, and let's say 3. And I want to go to 1. And you can see that now my cube is in a specific position where X is 5, Y is 3, and Z is 1, right? So a lot of times we do numeric transformations of my objects as opposed to just doing things by eye. And this is really great when I'm building a scene where I have a building that I'm going to build. For example, I want to build a house. I want to put walls in a specific location and so on. And I want to be very precise, and I can do that in Blender. Okay, so you can use something like if you have an architectural plan of a house, you can overlay it on top of the scene, and then what I can do is I can literally put in the walls at the exact size that I want them to be in the house, and I can build up a house with many levels in Blender. So again, so let's recap. So we talked about Blender's selection. Blender, you select with the right mouse button. The left mouse button only moves the 3-dimensional cursor in the editor right here. Or if you can grab the manipulator arms here, that's really what it's used for. But for the most part, what we want to do is we want to use the right mouse button for selection. Depending on where your cursor is, on the left or on the right, that's the panel that's active. So if I try and do a command like S on the right side, it'll do something totally different than if you had your cursor in the middle. So please be careful about that. Okay? Notice also that there's this little part about Blender down here, right? So there's this part on the top of the editor, and you've got another kind of piece down here, right? So I'm just going to bring this up so you can see it, this piece down here. And that is the timeline where you can do animations. Blender can be used to do from very simple animations to much more complex animations, all right? That we can track, we can save, and we can export into Unity if you want, okay? The questions around Blender, navigation, I talked about a few keys. So I'm going to here's some questions for you guys. So if I want to rotate an object, what's the hotkey to rotate an object? R, right? What's the hotkey? I'm going to ask you guys this on a test. It's going to come, right? What's the hotkey for me to delete an object from the scene? X, right? What's the hotkey if I want to look at the scene from a top-down view? 7. If I press 7 on the numeric keypad, I'll see it from the top-down view. All right. If I want to see it in orthographic mode, if I want to toggle ortho mode as opposed to perspective mode, what's the hotkey for that? 5. Right. Okay. 7. Well, that means 7 on the numeric keypad, which means you might have to turn the numeric keypad on sometimes. Sometimes it's off. Right. If I want to toggle back from orthographic to perspective, I just keep hitting the 5 key. If I want to look at it from the front, it's 1, and then the right side, it's 3. And then sometimes you want to model from one side or the other. One more thing to note is if you want to zoom in on an object that you've selected, you can press the period or the dot on the numeric keypad, and it'll zoom right into that object, right? Whatever object you've selected. Okay. Navigation, again, just to recap this, if you click down on the scroll wheel, you can tumble around the scene. If you scroll in and out, you can zoom in and out. If you press the scroll wheel and press the shift key, you can move an object right and left or up and down, not a problem, the whole scene. Okay, and that's really the stuff that I want you to know. Okay, so very basics about using Blender. All right, now let's get some real work done. So what I want to do, here's my goal for today. So I give you a little bit of a crash course on how to use Blender or whatever. But what I want to do is I want to create a maze. I've already created 2 tiles. Okay, so this is my goal. I want to create another tile with you here in Blender. I want to take that tile, import it into Unity, right? Create a bit of a tile map with Unity, right? Make a first-person perspective character. Drag him into Unity, right? As an example. And I want to make a walking scene where you walk through the scene in VR with Unity. So that's what we're going to do. So part of this is what we're doing is we're actually creating an object. And this part here is just the intro to Blender to do that. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to clear this object. So I don't want this object here. So let's just get rid of it. I want to press the 7 key to go from a top-down view and scroll back out so I can see my entire scene. And I want to center my screen by using the scroll wheel and centering it in the middle. I want to move into orthographic mode, so I'm going to press the 5 key to make it as flat as possible. Actually, you know what? Let's leave it in perspective mode. It's easier for you to see the grid. So there's my grid, and I want to add in a plane, a basic plane. Okay, so I want to do Shift A, and I want to add a plane. This is the actual work we're doing today, so please do this with me. Yeah, if your numeric keypad doesn't work, you can always go to View, and if you look over here, it'll do the same work. You can see all the shortcuts right here. All right, so here I am on the top view, and I'm top perspective view, and I want to add, so Shift A, I want to add a new object. I want to add a plane. Notice that my plane is very small. I want to make it the size of my grid. So I'm going to press the S key, and I'll move this plane out so it's the size of my grid, approximately like this. Notice on the right-hand side in Numeric Transform, you must have the Numeric Transform up to see this, right? This part, the N key. You can see that I have my scale as 7.869. That's no good. Let's make it all 8s. So 8. The Y should be 8. And the Z should be 8 as well. Okay, so there's 8 at 8. You should also have dimensions that are 16 by 16. And that's the size of my plane. My plane really, when we bring it into Unity, is going to be 16 meters by 16 meters, right? That's what I'm going to be doing. So all my tiles are 16 by 16 coming into Unity, right? Right now, it's just a flat plane. Are you with me?
Yes.
Anyone not with me? By the way, even if you can't do this or you're unsuccessful after this, I will drag your tile number 3. You guys are the third class. I did tile 1 with class number 1. I did tile 2 with class number 2, and you guys are going to do tile 3. I'm going to put it up on Slack, and then next week we'll have an option to use all 3 tiles to make our tile map. Next week's plan is I want to use some code to procedurally generate an entire maze, right? Randomly, basically, create a maze with a little C# script, right? Which is going to just explode a big maze out from a few tiles, a few prefabs. All right, so here we are. We've got our, we're going to bring it into VR. Yeah, that's the whole idea. So here we are. Here's our tile, and it's pretty boring. So I want to go into edit mode. So please use the tab key to bring this into edit mode. In edit mode, you're going to see that this should be completely orange, right? Orange means it's selected, right? Now in edit mode, I want you to think about each object as a container, right? So all objects, everything you make is a container. In this particular case, this object has a plane inside of it, and that's the default when you create a primitive. You can add other objects in here too. For now, let's just leave it as a plane. So when I press A, press the A key, I can select all or deselect all. Notice on the right-hand side, my numeric stuff is going crazy because it's context sensitive. When I press A, it selects all, and you can see that it highlights the object. Remember we talked about that all polygonal objects. This right now is just a quad that we're looking at. All polygonal objects have three ways of selection. We can select the vertices, the edges, and the faces. Right now, by default, we're in vertex select mode. So if I press the A key, so we're not selected, and if I right-click on a vertex, like right here, you can see that I can select that vertex. Please don't do this. Just watch for a second. If I press the G key, just like I did in object mode, I can move my vertex around and deform my vertex, right? If I press Control Tab, I will undo this in a second, so just wait. Press Control Tab, I can go to Edge Select mode, and if I select an edge, again, I can modify my edge to manipulate, and that's why it's called Edit mode. I can edit my object, right? If I press Control Tab again, I can go into Face Select mode, and I get this little dot in the middle of the face, and I can do stuff in there as well, if that makes sense. Okay, so I got all kinds of stuff that I can do. I'm going to undo those changes. So Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. Again, I have 32 undos that I can do by default. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to put that selection to everything in. So let's select all by pressing A. Right, so toggle the selection mode so everything is selected. You should see your quad. Now on the left-hand side where the toolbar is, remember we can toggle the toolbar by pressing the T key. This left-hand toolbar, you'll see something called Subdivide. Please click that button once. When I subdivide, you see that my objects now are subdivided into 4 quadrants, right? If you don't move anything, on the left-hand side, you'll see there's the number of cuts. Number of cuts on the left-hand side. I'm sorry, my keystone's a little off on this camera, so you may not see this stuff. I didn't realize that. Let me just make this a little smaller so you can see that. I'll make my screen a little smaller. I'm sorry about that. That's a little better. Okay, so you can see on the left-hand side, I've just click Subdivide, and there's number of cuts. I want you to press the little arrow here and move to 9 cuts. So what does this mean? This means that I have a grid that's 10 by 10 by 10 grid, right? That's 16 meters by 16 meters. And this grid, I want you to think about it like graph paper. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select certain faces on the grid, and then I'm going to extrude them up to make them look like walls, okay, all at once, right? And that'll be our maze tile. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So watch, don't do yet, watch. I'm going to move into Control Tab. I'm going to go into Face Select mode. Notice when I go in my Face Select mode that I have little dots that are in the middle of each of the faces. That's how you know we're in Face Select mode, okay? If I press A now, I can toggle off all of these, all the faces. You can see that I've done that. I'm just going to go in and turn off. I'm going to quit Discord for a second, just so I don't want to be bothered. I'll get bothered on my watch instead. All right. But if you notice here, I've got all these faces, and what I want to do is I want to right-click And if I want to select more than one object or more than one face, I'm going to do a shift right click. So imagine I have a tile. I want to make this tile where there's a kind of a middle area here. This is a little different than I did the other class. I'm going to shift right click these areas here. So here's I'm just dividing the tile in half. And I'm also going to make it so that it is kind of a T tile. So there's some walls over here. I want you to picture each, like 2 squares would be a place where a character can walk. So I'm going to kind of put a little corridor here like this. You'll see what I'm doing in a second. And the same thing goes with maybe a little bit of a bump over here. Not exactly the whole thing, right? Maybe even put kind of like a thing like that. Okay, so now you're like, hey, that's really not exciting, Tom. Okay, good. So what I want you to do now is I want you to kind of click down on your scroll wheel so you can see it in perspective mode for a second, right? And now I want you to press the E key. When you press the E key, you're extruding. And this is what happens. You can make walls of your maze. Now, I don't want them to be some random height. I want you to make them, I want you to press the 4 key to make them exactly 4 meters high and press enter, right? Let me do that again. I'm going to undo that change. So undo, I'm here as an example. And I want to extrude up. So I'm going to press the E key for extrude. Now notice if I go down, I can actually extrude down again. If I go towards the center or out, depending on what I do, I can make it so that it'll follow my mouse, right? So I can kind of extrude in or I can extrude up. And I want to extrude up this way. And I want to press the number 4, and press enter to make it 4 meters high. Yeah.
Go back at the highlight.
The where?
10 by 10.
Yeah, you got the 10 by 10 grid? So what you're going to do is, thank you. So what you're going to do is if I undo, I want you to shift right click any one of those faces. So right click, shift right click, and create your own pattern, right? Now what you want to do is you want to give at least, so think about the characters are going to walk here, right? Character's going to walk where it's not highlighted, right? So I want at least, 2 squares where the character is going to physically walk, right? Now you can make it other. If you only made it 1 square, it'd be really a tight fit for a character to walk through. It's almost like a 5-foot corridor if you made it, 1 square, right?
So are we making these do like into scaling? It's just like 1 by 1.
It's each of these. No, the whole thing is 16 meters, and I divided by 10,
Okay.
right? So if 16 meters divided by 10 is roughly 1.6 meters for every tile.
Okay.
Okay, which is almost 6 feet. Let's say 5 something, right? So if you think about it, it's almost like 5-foot tiles, almost. If you think about these as 5-foot tiles, right, from a feet perspective, that means you need about 10 feet to walk. Like, you need 10 feet across, like a corridor. Yeah.
Translate directly 1 centimeter.
Because I've changed the scale, yes. All right, which is really accurate, which is really cool. Okay, so
Is this same as Unreal? I'm guessing?
not quite. Unreal is weird. Unreal does things a little weirder. Yeah, so it's something slightly different, right? And so now, if I press the E key, are you with me, Terry? No. So the whole thing, and you haven't subdivided yet. So if the dots, did you subdivide or no? Okay, good. Stop. So Control Tab. Control Tab gives you the face select mode. That'll give you the dots. You got that now? Good. And then when you go to if you press A again to deselect all, right? Then you can shift right click for you to make your maze. Let me know when you're there, and then we'll use the extrude key to extrude up. And Corey, are you there?
I've put mine, it's here, got this, remember that's like you need to.
Are we there, Corey? Terry, you good? Okay. So if you're all with me, now we're going to extrude up, right? So the way to extrude up, for you guys have done it already, I'm going to press E to extrude up, the E key, and then I'm going to move up. I'm going to press the 4 key, and it's going to give me exactly 4 meters high. And if I press enter, it'll solidify that 4 meters, right? So now my maze tile is 4 meters high, okay? And it's important to do 4 meters because I did 4 meters on the other tiles. Okay, cool. guys, we've done our maze tile. We need to save the Blender file on the desktop. So please do that. So I'm going to go File, Save As, and I'm going to choose my desktop. Okay, so now there's more. I have more than one desktop. I have to move it around, but desktop is what I'm going to choose, right? And I'm going to call this thing Tile 3. Please call yours Tile 3, right? Again, you can call it whatever you like, but I'm going to make it Tile 3 because I've already got Tile 1 and Tile 2. All right, save. Now I can close down Blender. I don't need Blender anymore, so please close Blender down.
The blend file directly?
Yep. You'll see this in a second. So here's my Tile 3. I'm going to put this on Slack so everyone has Tile 3. So we're all on the same page. I'm just going to drag and drop. If you if somehow you weren't successful into doing what I just did or you couldn't follow along, I'm going to drag Tile 3 onto Blender. So now in Blender, you should have Tile 1, Tile 2, and Tile 3, right? You guys are the lucky class because the other class only had Tile 1. There's Tile 3 right here. Okay, so just in case you couldn't do it, use my Tile 3. Okay, just in case you couldn't do it. All right, so now I'm going to kick off Unity. I'm going to kick off Unity, right? So when we kick off Unity, we're going to make a 3D project. So I'm going to go to Unity. Again, just what I noticed, what I mentioned earlier, right? Unity has to, the one I'm using is 2017.3 at this recording. Okay. Now the Blender part is done, so I'm going to stop the recording and make another one for the Unity piece. So you can watch the Blender piece differently. Okay.